Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier. Here, as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, good to be back with you.
It's good to be back on with you, Eugene.
Thank you so much. Happy to have everyone here with us, our viewers, of course, regular viewers, new viewers, all of you. Happy to have you here with us. And of course, some of you are watching this show here on YouTube. And for those of you, I certainly would like to remind you that now would be a great time, perhaps the best time, to hit the subscribe button and then also hit the bell so you get the alerts for the things that you've subscribed to, so that you have easy access to all of our Breakthrough News content, including dispatches with Rania Khalek and a number of other fantastic things we have coming out for you every day. I know some folks here are also watching on Free Speech TV, so big shout out to you. You don't have to do anything except keep watching Free Speech TV and supporting all the great content there, and shout out to the FSTV team for making it possible to appear to you on your television screen here on the Freedom Side. Rania, are there other things you would like our viewers to know as we get the show off the ground here?
Why, Eugene? Yes, there are some other things. It's funny you should ask. I want to let our viewers know, first and foremost, make sure you smash that like button. If you're watching, it helps boost us in the algorithm. But also, if you appreciate Breakthrough News and everything we're about, you can become a Breakthrough News member and help support our journalism here by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. For as little as $5 a month, you can help support a very important independent media outlet, if I do say so myself. And you can access exclusive content, including some very cool merch like this mug that I'm holding up, and here's the other side of the mug is on Eugene's, has, the BT logo, Breakthrough News, very, very cool mug. More importantly, I will say this over and over again, I think that we've learned throughout this horrific genocide in Gaza, if we didn't already know, that independent media is more crucial than ever because the entire corporate media apparatus lies. So if you want honest, truthful reporting that is not in bed with the horrific war machine, I do encourage you, if you are able to for as little as $5 a month, become a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. If everybody who's watching, who's consuming our content, gave just a few dollars, we could really, I think, change a lot of things.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's true. We could generate millions of dollars that would help support institutions that are only accountable to you. And I think that's something that people want to see, and part of why you're here in the first place, because the mainstream media, as Rania pointed out, is not only bad, but certainly not accountable to us, accountable to the investors, the advertisers, and every other, entity from the big business world that actually is backing those institutions. So yes, certainly would appreciate it. Patreon.com/Breakthrough News. You get the mug, you get, exclusive content, and you just get the peace of mind of knowing that you're supporting something fantastic that you obviously like because you're here and you're watching it. So we got a great show for you here, as we always do, going around the world, from Africa to South Korea to Mexico to Palestine to here in the United States. So we've got lots of great stuff coming up for you here, and it would be a great time right now that you could let whoever you feel you need to let know, your friends, your neighbors, your enemies, in fact, to that we are getting ready to start the show. Knock on a door, send a text message, air horns, carrier pigeons, whatever seems right to carry the message, because we want whoever's following you to be following us here on the Freedom Side. But on that note, I will say we will start in Africa, and we want to start with the nation of Western Sahara, the Sahrawi people who have been fighting for many, many years Africa's last colony, Western Sahara is often called, but you don't hear a lot about it. So we are happy to be discussing this topic and also many of the worldwide reverberations, including as it concerns solidarity with the Palestinian people. And we are very, very happy to be joined here once again by Majoub Malia, who's the head of the External Relations Committee of CODESA, with its collective of Sahrawi human rights defenders in the Western Sahara. Majoub, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Rania. Pleasure to be with you again.
Well, it's really our pleasure to have you here. And I think some people may have seen Western Sahara in the news recently because Prime Minister Netanyahu held up a map of Africa, of North Africa, that had Western Sahara appropriately listed. And then, of course, within hours, he walked it back because of protests from Morocco, which has, of course, normalized relations with Israel. And, you know, I think people maybe saw that headline, and that's maybe about all they saw or all they know. So, I mean, tell us something, if you could, about, you know, the nature of Western Sahara and its colonial status.
Well, thank you for having me. And before starting, let me just comment on Netanyahu holding the map, the correct map, by the way. And if I may say that it's not appreciated and it's not welcome. Colonial regimes seems to ally with each other. So from our side, we don't appreciate the position of Netanyahu, and we do really stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people and condemn the massacres, genocide, and ethnic cleansing committed against the Palestinian civilians in occupied Palestine. Western Sahara is indeed the last colony of Africa, located in northwest Africa, with borders with Morocco to the north, Algeria to the east, and Mauritania to the south and east. Western Sahara was a Spanish colony since 1884 till 1975, when Spain decided to withdraw from the territory, or abandon the territory to be more accurate, without fulfilling its commitment to the international law and completing the decolonization process in a treaty between Morocco, Madrid, Spain, and Mauritania to divide the territory among the two parties, the two neighboring countries. After that, Western Sahara, the Sahrawi people, through its national liberation movement, the Polisario Front, which is the legal and the sole representative of the Sahrawi people, raised the arms in legitimate resistance against the occupation from both Morocco and Mauritania. Mauritania in 1979 decided to withdraw its claim over Western Sahara, recognize the Sahrawi Republic, and Morocco, in the other side, continued to annex more territories of the occupied Western Sahara. Nowadays, Western Sahara is divided in two parts. One is occupied territories and to the west of the berm, which is the separation wall with millions of landmines. And east of the berm, there is the liberated territory controlled by the Polisario Front and the Sahrawi Republic. In 1991, the UN brokered the ceasefire deal between the Moroccan occupation forces and the Polisario, where the MINURSO, or the UN mission for the organization of a referendum in Western Sahara, was established and moved into the territory. Since 1991, we are still waiting for that referendum to take place. We are decades away, a referendum that is blocked by the Moroccan occupation forces. During all these years, the Sahrawi people have been suffering from the hostile military occupation of Morocco present in the territory, of course, committing crimes against humanity and war crimes throughout the years of occupation. On daily basis, the Sahrawi civilians are facing oppression by the Moroccan occupation forces, but we also see strategic colonial policies implemented in Western Sahara, such as such as the settlement and demographic transfer, demographic engineering in the territory, the human rights violations on daily basis, the forced allegiance imposed on Sahrawis that they have no access to their natural resources or to any economical activities without swearing allegiance to the Moroccan occupation. So I briefly try to summarize the situation in Western Sahara, which is most of the time referred to as the forgotten conflict in Africa.
Can you talk a bit about how the normalization deal between Morocco and Israel that was brokered by the Trump administration impacted Western Sahara? I mean, a part of that deal had basically the U.S. and Israel both recognizing Moroccan sovereignty, as they call it, over Western Sahara.
Well, let's first start from the legal basis of the question of Western Sahara. So, define the presence of Morocco in Western Sahara legally before we move forward into the political positions. So, Morocco, as confirmed and reaffirmed by international courts such as the International Court of Justice, and recently multiple times by the European Court of Justice, that Morocco has no sovereignty over Western Sahara. And Morocco has no administering capacity over Western Sahara because it is a Spanish capacity, and Spain cannot transfer that capacity to a third country without obtaining the consent of the people of Western Sahara. So the only description of Moroccan presence in Western Sahara is being a hostile military occupation, which continues to even violate the law of occupation by denying or refusing to recognize itself as an occupying power in Western Sahara. So searching for such legitimacy over Western Sahara made Morocco to basically put himself in the hands of the devil, or falling into what they call the so-called normalization. So the normalization at the end happened or was sold to the Moroccan people first, arguing that the position in Western Sahara will be the priority number one for the people of Morocco. However, the proclamation made by President Trump back in that time remains without any legal value. Doesn't change anything in the legality of the question of Western Sahara, and that we have seen in the recent judgments by the European Court of Justice years and years ago. So this normalization, or this Abraham Accord, as they wish to call it, did not change anything on the legal side of the question of Western Sahara, but it did change one major thing. It was received by the Moroccan occupation power as a green light to continue committing crimes against humanity, human rights violations, and breaches of all clauses of international law in Western Sahara.
Well, I appreciate that context, and I was hoping you've mentioned it several times, to dig a little bit deeper on the human rights issues, because I know, especially in the occupied parts of Western Sahara, there's an extreme level of repression on anybody who expresses any sort of opposition to the occupation. I was hoping you could just talk a little bit more about how people in the occupied territories are subject to such significant restrictions.
Yeah, the human rights situation in the occupied territory of Western Sahara is very severe. The Moroccan occupation forces have a mandate to crack down any voice dare to raise against the presence of occupation. And anyone who dares to object on the Moroccan presence in Western Sahara will face severe consequences. From normal civilians that are discriminated, children at school are discriminated just for being Sahrawis. Women in the streets are are oppressed just for wearing the traditional Sahrawi clothes. And then when we move on to the activists or human rights defenders, students, trade unions, activists, those are the most targeted by the Moroccan occupation forces. We have dozens and dozens of activists in Moroccan prisons. Some of them are sentenced to life just because they are Sahrawis, just because they defend the very fundamental right of the Sahrawi people to self-determination. The plunder of natural resources is an ongoing crime for decades. Sahrawis have no access to those natural resources, while Morocco is trading those resources with multinational companies and with international organizations such as the European Union, for instance, in order to keep them or to maintain their silence over the situation on the ground. Currently, we have over 50 activists in Moroccan prisons, and just today, 2 Sahrawi students were sentenced to 10 years in prison just because of their activism supporting the right to self-determination of the Sahrawi people. We have seen houses put under siege, including the Codesa's president's house, who have been put multiple times under siege, preventing people from accessing it. And a couple of weeks ago, the family had a newborn, and they were not allowed to even receive visitors to congratulate them with the newborn baby. Women are put also under in a severe conditions. We have seen the case of Sultana Khaya, who was for almost 2 years under house arrest, and we keep seeing that. On a systematic basis. So the warning here that Morocco is committing grave human rights violations against the Sahrawi civilians, while the international community is ignoring that. And in the same moment, we have a UN mission in place in Laayoune, exactly where our organization is based. And that mission is the only mission in the world that has no mandate to monitor or protect human rights in Western Sahara. Can you imagine that? So all missions behind those human rights slogans that has been waved for decades. And that brings us to put very, very important questions. Do we really have to be violent to be allowed to access or to exercise our fundamental rights? Do we need to be cleansed before the international community pay attention to our question? So Western Sahara in brief is a dark hole for the entire world. No international media have access to it. No international organizations have access to the occupied territory of Western Sahara, and no one really know what's going on except few reports that are prepared by local NGOs who are trying to echo the voices of the civilians in occupied territories, but that's still ignored by the mainstream media, who have different agendas and priorities.
No, I think that's a critically important point, and that's why we were so honored that you would be willing to join us here on the show. I mean, quickly before we let you go, Majub, how can people find more from your organization, Codesa?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have a website yet. We're working on that, and hopefully soon it will be launched. But you can always follow the webpage, the Twitter page of Codesa, where we post regular reports. And just before closing that, Eugene, if you allow me, and Rania,
Please.
if you allow me to comment also on some recent developments related to Spain, that is the responsible over the occupation and the situation in Western Sahara. as it was the colonial power that didn't fulfill its commitment to decolonize Western Sahara. So recently we have seen the Spanish position on supporting the Moroccan proposal, so-called autonomy plan. In exchange of that, Sanchez has raised three major promises to the Spanish people. One of them was that he will get recognition from Morocco of Spanish sovereignty over Ceuta and Melilla, who are on borders with Morocco, and he promised also that Morocco will cooperate on the immigration issue, and making these promises. But at the end, none of these promises has been realized. So that brings us to the question: what did Spain gain from such a position, while all these promises made to the Spanish people are not fulfilled? So to conclude, we remain holding Spain as responsible over what's happening in Western Sahara. Of course, Morocco is an occupying force in Western Sahara committing crimes, but that is under the umbrella of the European Union, Spain, and the United Nations as a whole. And thank you for having me.
No, Majub, thank you so much. That's Majub Malia, the head of the External Relations Committee of CODESA. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Rania?
Eugene, I mean, what can you say other than occupiers, colonizers, they stick together.
Yeah, they do 100%, and this is just another example of that. Really shameful. I saw that in some of the B-roll we had there, the head of Sumar, is the vice president of Spain, was in some of those. So you'd like to think that now that they're in the government, they'd put some pressure on to address this issue. But we're seeing it more and more. These countries who Morocco is trying to cajole them, into recognizing them. It's actually became an issue at the last meeting of the Decolonization Committee of the United Nations, where Morocco is making all these big protests saying Western Sahara has no right, to be heard. Sort of it's completely absurd. But yeah, something to follow. I hope people follow it. Really, really crucial issue. One that's not out there a lot, but one, if you're setting your news tabs on what you're getting sent to you on Google News Alerts, put Western Sahara in there and spread the word. We're going to turn our attention now to the border between the United States and Mexico, where U.S. politics has been focused for a good chunk of this week after President Biden decided to put forward an executive order to allow him to, quote unquote, shut down the border. A lot to that, of course, and we are very happy to be joined once again here on the show by Todd Miller, who's an author and journalist specializing in border issues. Todd, as always, thanks so much for joining us here on the show. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, no. Is it on our side?
It might be on our side. I think
Sorry,
since we just took them
guys.
off, it is maybe on our side. We'll come back to that in just a second, because it's definitely an important issue. Working on that there. But yeah, no, I mean, I think going back to the issue we were saying of Western Sahara, I also want to note, South Africa, which has been a big supporter of Palestine, also is a big supporter of Western Sahara. Algeria, which is one of the countries that not only has not normalized, but many people don't know this, but the Algerian parliament actually voted to give the president the power to go to war against Israel if he so chooses, in the context of what's happening in Gaza. So, a connection on multiple fronts. And I think, as Majub opened with, the Western Sahara government, this Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, SADR, has since from the very beginning been supporting Palestine very, very strongly. There's a long history there, of that kind of solidarity. So it's not random or rare, but just want to note that despite Netanyahu being given the wrong map, there's no relationship whatsoever between the Western Sahara people and Palestine. They've always been with Palestine 110% and continue to be today. And I have to say, I always find it to be, really laudable, because of course here you are fighting this colonial struggle that many people have just completely forgotten and know nothing about. I think you'd have every reason in the world to perhaps be upset that you're not being discussed, but none of that kind of cynicism at all. Just total support also for struggling people all around the world, quite frankly. We do have Todd back with us. We're going to turn back to the U.S. border. Todd, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, great to have you.
Sorry about that, Mike.
No, listen, these are the challenges of our modern age, as it were.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, great to have you here as always. And maybe let's just start with the executive order and what it really means. I mean, a lot of people saying, "Oh, Biden is now shutting down the border," blah blah blah. But I think beyond the headlines, the content is definitely important.
Yeah, of course. As always, we have to go beyond those headlines. First of all, shutting. It's not. I mean, it's not really shutting down the border. The idea of shutting down the border and putting a close sign on the border, the ports of entry are definitely not shut down. It's a shutdown that's very much directed at people crossing the border, and specifically asylum seekers, and restricting asylum seekers, or pretty much putting a ban on asylum seekers if the number of people, what they call border patrol encounters, surpasses 2,500. So that's the what the executive order does basically. And I mean, there's more stuff to it, but that's basically what it does. But beyond the kind of headline soundbite of it, I think it's important to know a couple things. One is the first thing I thought when I saw it, although it definitely will cause distress for people, especially those seeking asylum. I think we also have to look at this as another act of border theater in the campaign season, right? In this sense, it should come as no surprise. The Biden administration and Biden himself has, since the beginning of the year, pretty much told people that he will go to the right of Trump on immigration issues, border issues. We saw this in February when there was a lot of talk about the border bill, right? If people probably remember the border bill, the Democrats are championing this border bill. The border bill could have been written by Trump himself, right? It had that sort of right wing, what the right wing wants in terms of putting up more walls and surveillance technology and hiring more agents and more draconian enforcement mechanisms, all of that. And when that was rejected in February and pretty much rejected by Trump, by the Biden camp went on the offensive saying, "Oh, you don't want your own bill," right? Pretty much saying that they were going to be trying to strategically put themselves on the other side of Trump, probably perceiving that would be a sort of campaign weakness. And so I see this new executive order as definitely a part of that election theater, campaign strategy. It's all about trying to garner votes. And there's another thing I just want to mention about this, and I think this one's more important. The kind of going to the right of Trump also doesn't underscore something else that needs to be underscored: the fact that the border and border enforcement and the border buildup and the fact that asylum restrictions would be announced at all by Biden is also not surprising. It's the border buildup has been quite bipartisan now for decades. So anyone following this for decades should not be surprised at all about this. Should not, even watching how the first 3 or 4 years of the Biden administration and how they started with, campaign promises in 2020 or 2020, actually, about, bringing a more humane border. But throughout the last 3 years, you can see increasing budgets going to Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, increasing enforcement mechanisms. We're now dealing with the largest budgets for border and immigration enforcement we've ever seen, not to mention the most money going to private companies. So the privatization aspect of the border is higher than ever. And when you put it in this context, and then also in the decades-long trajectory of Democrats on the border, from Barack Obama, deporter-in-chief, 3 million people deported under the Barack Obama administration, the Bill Clinton administration, which started the deterrence strategy that we see on the border. Then you can start to analytically put this in its correct position. And this is just another layer of this deterrence strategy that really started under Bill Clinton 30 years ago and persists in a bipartisan fashion up to now.
Todd, I'm really glad you raised that. And this has been described as basically a violation of international law. I'm just curious. I know this is a bipartisan effort that we've seen with border militarization, one administration after the next. They're completely in cooperation here. Obviously, Republicans are rhetorically more dangerous in how they describe immigrants, but Democratic policy doesn't really shift or change. It's a part of the same process. So I guess I'm curious, how significant is this latest development and why is it a violation of international law? And the significance aspect, I'm asking about that in the sense of is this worse than anything Trump did?
Yeah. So it violates international law because people have the right to ask for asylum. And so for an administration to say that's restricted is a clear violation of international law. It's also the same exact thing that Trump did. He did this in 2018. He used the same statute in the Immigration and Nationality Act in 2018. It really didn't amount to much, and that's. Other things that Trump did definitely amounted to more. This was actually knocked down by a court. These are campaign maneuvers by Biden in that sense, where they must perceive that it's the border immigration is a weak link, and they are trying to preemptively maneuver to what's going to be an onslaught of criticism. In fact, one of the interesting things you see rhetorically at this point is this constant mantra of open borders. The Democrats are all about open borders this, open borders that, open borders the other thing. Anyone who just takes a look at just a cursory glance or just look at the DHS budgets or anything, right? Any just really superficial 5 minutes of effort can see that the border is not remotely close to being open. It's not and yet this sort of perception is just constantly just these accusations are made, and it's actually believed among huge swaths of population. And it just seems like we're in a delusion, right, around the border. There's a huge, massive delusion. And instead of looking at what really is going on and looking at what really these policies are going to do, it's all about perception and manipulating perception. And what happens is the people, and unfortunately the most vulnerable people on planet Earth, the ones, in this case, the ones that are looking for refuge, are the ones that are going to pay the consequences of it.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that as well, Todd, because I think that misperception is the huge factor. I mean, you study this closely, so I'm sure you've seen how this military age male thing has become the, right-wing talking point. People saying they're building an army, whoever they is, are building an army. So talk more about that if you could. I mean, why are people coming to the United States in such large numbers?
Well, that's a thing. Is it what I've seen, the numbers have been down comparatively speaking. I mean, you can see broader trends of increased amounts of people, but is it just one thing? We know, dealing with talking about asylum seekers, there's real reasons why people are fleeing different degrees of persecution in countries where they're coming from organized crimes to the police. One part of this is a police state apparatus and kind of the collusion between organized crime and the police state and army. That part of it is often not even discussed, yet the United States is always giving money, military aid to places in Central America, for example, or Mexico, when it's been shown clearly that there's a collusion between organized crime and the police. So there's that part of it, and that often leads to people fleeing persecution. There's also 100,000 other things that why people are coming. It's often multifaceted. There's economic reasons for sure, and one of the things that always it's a kind of a pet peeve or just outright disgusts me, I should say, is this idea that there's something like people that are coming for economic reasons. Well, that's not, people are fleeing for their lives. Well, that's, we can justify that. But if they're coming for economic reasons, well, that's not okay. They don't need to come. Well, why don't we look at why some of the economic reasons, like some of the economic structural adjustment that's happened at the behest of the United States, right? How like economic structural adjustment has benefited corporations. Those U.S. corporations go into countries all around the world and take whatever they want, and then kind of marginalize huge swaths of population. And those are the populations that are migrating. People don't migrate because they want to. In most cases, it's usually because they feel forced to, and not making ends meet is one of those reasons. Some people call it economic violence. There's also environmental reasons, and those are becoming more and more prominent. The climate reasons, you look at Central America, even Customs and Border Protection, and in a report in 2019 was saying, in Guatemala, the reason people are leaving are due to food security in these certain departments in Guatemala. And it happened to be these apartments under excessive drought, these excessive droughts that have happened in the last 10 years that climate scientists have attributed to the changing climate. So those ideas, there's what I'm trying to say is it's not usually, there's a bunch of different reasons. And those reasons, if we start breaking them down and unpacking them, I start seeing, wow, the United States is involved in a lot of these reasons. You can look at like economic imperialism, right? You can look at, the United States is responsible for most of the greenhouse gases historically, and exceedingly so, right? And when you start seeing the sort of responsibility for some of the reasons why people migrate in the first place coming from the United States, this border building, this border enforcement, this like denial of asylum, this forcing people by the deterrence strategy into deserts, into deadly situations, becomes even more heinous and more imperative to look at very closely.
Well, Todd, as always, we really appreciate you having us here to sort through all of these various important pieces. Todd Miller, author and journalist specializing in border issues. Thanks so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Rania?
I mean, Eugene, I don't know what to say about this other than it's just everything that they said during the Trump administration was a lie. They don't care about anybody in cages. It's like, I don't see any Congress people rushing to the border to go cry like they did.
No, in fact, all the ones who rush to the border to go cry are spending all their time standing by President Joe Biden and telling all of us why we need to vote for him because of, I forget now why, because, the last time they said it was because of immigrants. And they said it was because of Muslims. They said it was because of this, because of that. You and I were even on a show where someone said it was because of Iran. But, we saw how that turned out, but won't mention any names there. You can go back and watch the Katie Halper show if you want to see how I was right about why you shouldn't vote for Joe Biden there in 2020. Nonetheless, we will move forward here. Another critical issue, and that is ongoing tensions, in Northeast Asia. A lot of misinformation, I would argue, about what we know as North Korea and just the ongoing militarization of East Asia in general. We are very, very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Joo-Hyun Park, who is a member of Notatal and the engagement editor at The Real News. Joo-Hyun, as always, thanks so much for joining us.
Eugene, Rania, great to be back. Good to see you.
Great to have you here. And I guess I want to start with maybe the one headline that sadly is the one thing people have probably heard about regarding the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, over the past couple weeks. And that is this issue of the quote unquote trash balloons. I know you've seen the stories and you've seen how it's being framed. So I won't say too much more than that. Maybe just give us a sense about what's really going on with this story and as opposed to the way it's being reported.
Yeah, absolutely. To give a little bit of background to those that may have missed the events of the last couple of weeks, there was an exchange of balloons from North and South Korea that was occurring. And to provide a little bit of background, for a very long time now, the US has provided funding to right-wing organizations in South Korea that send propaganda balloons carrying leaflets and USB drives to the North. This has been going on for decades, and it's all done through the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a self-described organization carrying forward the work of the CIA. Now, the DPRK has objected to these for a long time, but also has not really done so much to directly oppose them until now. In the past week or so, the DPRK sent probably over 1,000 balloons carrying bags of garbage and manure towards the south, kind of a symbolic, and if you have a sense of humor, pretty funny gesture to the governments of South Korea and the US to let them know exactly what they think of the propaganda leaflets that are routinely dropped over North Korea. I would also note, adding to the argument for a sense of humor, that Kim Yo-jung, the deputy director of publicity and information for the DPRK, told the South Korean government quite sarcastically that the balloons were a gift sent in the spirit of freedom of expression, which is the grounds under which South Korea defends the use of NGOs that send their own propaganda balloons to the north. Now, there are a couple of significant developments and implications of this move that I think are definitely worth highlighting. And I think to do so, we do need to kind of establish that there was a paradigm shift in Korea in the last several months in terms of the inter-Korean relations, and this has been building for some time. The chief cause of this change is the escalation in US and South Korean aggression that has taken place since 2022, and the DPRK has responded to that in two ways. First off, it's declared itself a nuclear state, stating that it considers its nuclear arsenal perfectly legal and that these weapons are no longer up for negotiation with foreign powers. And secondly, towards the end of last year, beginning of this year, the DPRK also stated that it would no longer be pursuing peaceful reunification as a strategy, that it would be defining its borders for the first time in its history, and also, that it would respond to continued escalation towards war firmly and would not back down from a confrontation. So I think that's some important context to place all of this in, primarily to say that what's really changing here is that the DPRK is being much more assertive than it has been in the past about defending its sovereignty. There have been numerous other examples of that in the last couple of weeks. I realize I'm dropping a lot of information at this moment, though, so I'm going to just pause right there to, bring it back to you to steer the conversation.
Well, I'm curious how this is, like, if you could talk a bit about this trilateral meeting that took place and the significance of it. I mean, it's the first time that China, South Korea, Japan have met in 4.5 years or something. So the media was having a field day with it, trying to portray it as something very negative. And obviously, North Korea is always in the background of this in terms of, it's allied with China. The US tries to use Japan and South Korea against China. Not to say there isn't a history there that's outside of the US sphere, but obviously the US does, play a relationship or play a role of of making these countries basically become enemies with each other that otherwise would have much more cooperation because just geographically speaking, they're located in the same region. But I'm curious if you could speak to the significance of that meeting and, I guess obviously North Korea wasn't there, but that's, whenever it comes to China and South Korea having a relationship, the U.S., on top of being very anti-China, sees that as, something that's very negative because they're also anti-North Korea.
Yeah, absolutely. To kind of sum up what happened at the end of last month, May, there was a trilateral summit held between the governments of South Korea, Japan, and China for the first time in close to 5 years. And the reason why there had been that pause was because in 2019, South Korea and China in particular had a pretty big diplomatic spat regarding the construction of the US THAAD missile defense system, which has radar capabilities that can be used to spy on Chinese missile activities. In response to that, and to kind of state its objections, the Chinese government hit South Korea with a number of sanctions, which ended up actually sparking a lot of backlash in South Korea, particularly from the public. It also had the effect of hurting some economic ties in the form of tourism and cultural exports. And so crucial to looking at this summit is understanding that China is taking a different strategic approach to South Korea, or at least attempting to. And that's definitely happening in the round of increased military cooperation and consolidation in the Pacific by the United States, particularly using South Korea and Japan as key sorts of tools or pawns in that game. In the last few years, we've seen Washington give Tokyo the green light to remilitarize Japan, which is well on its way to doubling its military spending by 2027. South Korea and Japan have now been pulled into a trilateral alliance with the US, which is forming a keystone in the drive to form what's being colloquially referred to as an Asian NATO. And there's also some important dimensions on the economic front. We know that the Biden administration recently hit China with import tariffs. But beyond that, South Korea and Taiwan are very important to the US economic war on China because they're two of the leading semiconductor manufacturers in the world. So the US is pretty desperate to secure those supply chains for their own military and technological dominance, and also to making sure South Korea in a position of dependence as it becomes a hub in next generation technologies like electric vehicles, AI, automation, etc. So it's in that context that China is trying to stage an intervention of sorts and reset relations. And there's definitely incentive from the South Korean and Japanese side to go along with this to an extent. And that's because China is still their largest trading partner. And in South Korea's case, the widely unpopular President Yoon, who you can see on the screen right there, could really use a PR win these days, particularly on the diplomatic front. So there were some outcomes of the summit that were favorable to China, namely stated interest from all the parties in advancing negotiations for a trilateral free trade agreement for the region, and a commitment for the Chinese and South Korean ministries of defense to engage in security dialogues. But I also think it's very important to not overestimate the impact of the summit and similar initiatives that may follow. For one, the summit itself was quite short, and despite the aforementioned outcomes, it was mainly limited to discussions on pretty low stakes topics, things like climate change, things of that nature. And additionally, China is really facing an uphill battle in terms of the kinds of cooperation it can offer and secure to South Korea and Japan in comparison to what the US has over these countries. China may be a key part of South Korea and Japan's economies, but the governments of both these countries are totally subordinated politically to Washington. And that's not just because of the military leverage that the US wields. It's also because the ruling parties in these countries are ideologically committed to their alliances with the US. So ultimately, relative progress on diplomatic and economic ties with China just don't hold the same weight in terms of determining the future of the region as consolidation of a unified military bloc in the Pacific does. And finally, as you were mentioning, there's a certain actor that was left out of these talks, which is very important to the politics of the region, and that's the DPRK, or North Korea, which had some choice words and responses to the summit taking place at all. They launched a short-range ballistic missile test as an expression of displeasure. And as the summit concluded, they actually published a sternly worded statement from the foreign ministry, which was responding specifically to a moment in the trilateral summit when China, Japan, and South Korea all reaffirmed their commitment to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. I have a quote from that statement I'd like to read here, which I think, again, demonstrates the increased assertiveness that the DPRK is displaying. They said, and I quote, "If anyone tries to deny or violate the constitutional position of our country as a nuclear weapons state, preaching the benefits of denuclearization to us, it will be regarded as the most serious infringement upon our sovereignty. Such things as complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula has already died out theoretically, practically, and physically." So this is a very stern position from the DPRK. They have already established for a couple of years that they do consider themselves a nuclear state, and they're asserting that on the international stage, and even doing so in situations where China is involved, which I think says a lot about the independence that is being displayed by the DPRK in this moment, and really the complex politics that are playing out in Northeast Asia, where it's often presented as, two blocks, but in reality, there is a US bloc. And, there are alignments between the other countries that are not always 100%, even if they are generally, on the same page about many things.
No, I think that's a critically important point. And one other thing I want to get in here as well before we close that I just think, especially for our U.S. viewers to know, is the economic blockade against the DPRK and the role that plays in so many of the different challenges and things that they face. Because all you hear is negative. You don't hear anything about actually the economic drive they're in right now. But talk about that some if you could, because I feel like that's also a very important element of U.S. policy, towards Northeast Asia.
Yeah, absolutely. The DPRK has been under punishing sanctions for virtually its entire existence. And I mean, well back into 1948 when the state was first founded. However, the actual arc of the sanctions regime has changed over the preceding epochs. And, most recently, the DPRK was in a very sharp period of sanctions under what is called comprehensive sanctions, which were jointly implemented by the Obama and Trump administrations through a combination of presidential executive orders and UN Security Council resolutions. And what makes these sanctions comprehensive is that they impose limits on the amount of fuel that the DPRK can import. They place restrictive bans on virtually all of the DPRK's major industries, as well as other economic measures that are really designed to strangle the DPRK. But something that I think is actually quite important to note is that particularly since the beginning of the war in Ukraine and the backfired attempt by the United States to impose sanctions on Russia, the economic situation in the DPRK has been shifting because it's now in an international environment where U.S. Sanctions carry far less teeth. And what we're seeing actually is increased economic activity in a lot of fronts in the DPRK, particularly in the last couple of years. There's been a standing commitment from the government of the DPRK to build 50,000 new free apartments in the city of Pyongyang, which they are well on their way to achieving. And earlier this year, in addition to the change in line on reunification, the DPRK also announced the start of what it is calling the 20 by 10 Rural Development Plan. This is a plan to raise the level of the productive forces, diversify the economy of the countryside through an initiative to build 200 factories in rural areas over the next 10 decades, beginning with an emphasis this year on building factories that will be creating backpacks and clothing for school children, as well as the construction of hospitals in all rural areas to ensure that there is equality and access to health. So the DPRK is still a heavily sanctioned country, but it's operating in an international environment that is very different than what existed just a few years before. And I think that has a lot to do with explaining the shift in posture from the DPRK. And consequently, it has a lot to do in explaining why the U.S. is so determined to continue to rattle and threaten the Korean Peninsula, including the measures that they took just in the last couple of weeks, which included a number of U.S. military exercises, including the use of B-1B bombers, which have not been used in Korea in about 7 years. And I think most critically, later this August, the U.S. is planning to conduct nuclear war exercises on the Korean Peninsula. And, I really want to state the severity of that very clearly for everyone. We are living in a time where we are watching a genocide unfold in Gaza before our very eyes every single day. It's being done with U.S. arms. It's being done with U.S. funding. We're also living through really a civilizational crisis for humanity, right? We're looking at climate collapse. We're looking at poverty. We're looking at starvation. All these inherently solvable issues. And what is the United States doing? They're spending precious resources and time rehearsing for nuclear annihilation, rehearsing for essentially yet another genocide. And I think that really speaks to the political urgency of this moment and our need to be really building robust organizations and unity, a strong anti-imperialist movement within the United States. Because if we don't do it, then the stakes are only going to go up. And as we can see, there simply are no limits that the U.S. government is willing to impose on itself. So then that begs the question, who exactly is going to do it? And, as folks are about to do in a couple of days down in Washington with the People's Red Line for Gaza, it's going to have to be the people.
Joo Hyun Park, member of Noted Tall and engagement editor at The Real News. As always, it was our pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks again. You have a good one.
Rania?
So crazy how many countries we just our government has under blockade. And North Korea, the isolation of North Korea is one of the craziest of them. And also just the amount of lies you can tell about North Korea. I don't think there's any country in the world you can lie about with little, if any, there just won't be any. You can say the most insane thing about North Korea, just make up the most insane, ridiculous thing. And the New York Times will report it without question because you can just say whatever you want about North Korea.
It's really, as I always say to people about North Korea, whenever people think about it, and as someone who's traveled all over Africa, I can tell you that in large swaths of the African continent, moving to a country like North Korea would be like moving to paradise. I mean, the level of underdevelopment in Africa that speaks to is one thing, but the level of what they've been able to achieve there, despite all these challenges, I think is something that when you put it in comparative perspective to other countries in the global South, has to be considered very, very significant. I would argue, impressive. But that's a story for another day. today, we want to turn our attention now back to Mexico, which just had a historic presidential election. Claudia Sheinbaum was elected president there, first woman president of Mexico, or of any country, by the way, in North America, or what is known as North America. A lot of implications here. So to dig into all of this, we are very, very honored to be joined on the show once again by John Ackerman, who's a professor at the Institute for Legal Research at UNAM there in Mexico. John, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thank you, Eugene and Rania. A real pleasure to be with you. I don't know how long was the last time we talked. A few years ago.
A few months here.
A real pleasure. Yeah.
Well, hey, the pleasure is all ours. And maybe let's just start here with, some of the bigger picture issues as it concerns the election. For those who maybe don't know, I mean, who is Claudia Sheinbaum? She's mayor of Mexico City. But what does this victory really represent in terms of continuity or change in terms of Mexico's trajectory?
So this is a huge victory for the left in Mexico and Latin America, I would dare say the world, because in 2018, López Obrador came into power after about 30 years of intense neoliberal policies, various electoral frauds against him and his colleagues. That was a major achievement, but he still didn't have complete control over the government, of course, because many of the state governments, of the legislature itself, were really struggling against this social and political transformation. Of course, the oligarchs, the United States, this was a real challenge. The big question was whether this was going to be just a flash in the pan or whether this was actually going to be the beginning of a new historic moment for Mexico. Now we're 6 years later, 2024, and Morena, his party, has just swept the entire country. Morena now governs 24 of the 32 states. They're still doing the final calculations, but Morena has also won, it looks like, 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress, both Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. It has also ratified its control over Mexico City, and with a woman she was an academic, she was a professor, a climate scientist for a long time. Always been politically active, a student activist, was mayor of Mexico City. Her platform was to continue on build the second floor of the fourth transformation, winning 60% of the vote. 2-1 over the second place candidate, Xochitl Galvez, who was actually the candidate of almost all the parties together. Totally different, strange bedflowers. You have the PRI, which is the old authoritarian party, the PAN, which is the Christian Democratic right-wing party, the PRD, which used to be the left-wing party, which sold out about 5-10 years ago. They all kind of came together, ganged up against López Obrador, and they only got about 28% of the vote against the 60% for Claudia Sheinbaum. Over the last 30 years of democratic transition, no president has gotten that level of support. We've had presidents that have gotten, 37%, up to 50%, but 60%, this is a major mandate. It's a major blowout. And this is a big opportunity for the next 6 years. This is a 6-year presidency for Claudia Sheinbaum to really leave a mark on North America, Mexico, and Latin America.
Well, I actually think that this is hugely important regionally as well. You're talking about obviously domestically, Mexico is a huge country. It's very, very important. It's also in a tough position in a sense because Mexico has this really close relationship with the U.S. I mean, the U.S. is its neighbor, and obviously because of those 30 years of basically like neoliberal leaders, you do have a very integrated U.S. being very integrated into the Mexican economy. That said, having a more progressive government in Mexico could be very beneficial for progressives across the region. Can you talk a little bit about how this could benefit the, pink tide 2.0, as they like to call it, whether you like that framing or not, whether it could benefit that move across the region?
Yeah, most definitely. So when López Obrador came in 2018, he was pretty much alone, and ideologically speaking, actually the only sitting president who came to his inauguration, December 1st, 2018, with Evo Morales, who was still president of Bolivia at the time. Then Maduro showed up last minute, unannounced. But basically all the other governments at that moment had already, the first wave had ended, and we were in the middle of right-wing governments all over Latin America. Since then, since the López Obrador victory, we've had a whole second wave, of course. and the continuation of the Morena in Mexico means a great deal for Latin American unity, because now Mexico is no longer alone. We have Lula da Silva, who's come back in Brazil. We have Gustavo Petro, who has been, a really brave international leader from Colombia, tweeting down Netanyahu live on X, right? So those are the three largest countries in Latin America in terms of population: Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. Now we've had some setbacks, of course, in Argentina. Right? You have this crazy Milei figure who's thinks he's Trump in South America. But in general, you have Boric in Chile, who's is kind of a social democrat, lukewarm kind of guy. But he's given the history of Chilean politics, he's definitely on the progressive side. So there's a real possibility to continue bringing together Latin America. There's been a proposal on the table, for instance, to get rid of the Organization of American States and have that be replaced by CELAC, which is a community of Latin American Caribbean nations, which of course is based in Latin America, while of course the OAS is in Washington. And so there are lots of different possibilities of rethinking the geopolitical role of Latin America. Now, of course, Mexico is very much subordinate to the United States. 80-90% of our commerce, external commerce, goes to the United States. We're also, between one or two or three that major trading partner of the United States. There's this whole idea that Mexico needs to help the United States in its battle against China, commercial battle against China, which has kind of permeated through lots of the Mexican political class, including, unfortunately, part of the left. And so it's going to be interesting to see exactly how things fall on those issues in the new government. And of course, we can't. We need to put a lot more emphasis, like we just mentioned at the beginning, that this is the first female president in the history of Mexico. Mexico's supposed to be a macho country. Yeah, we got lots of machos here, of course, but you have it in the United States and all of the world. But actually, Mexico is actually not such a surprise that it might seem to people who don't know Mexico very well. It's actually, the last 10, 15 years, we've had a real push towards gender equality. Yeah, Mexico City passed same-sex marriage and abortion before San Francisco. This was like 20 years ago. And we have a new constitutional reform from 3 or 4 years ago, which requires absolutely all collective public bodies, like cabinets or the electoral council or the Supreme Court or the Chamber of Deputies or the senators, to be absolutely equal in terms of gender parity, right? So the Mexican Congress is 50-50, men and women. The Supreme Court is just about there through their recent appointments. And so to have a woman president is very, very much a logical step within this progress in terms of gender equality in Mexico and the political sphere in recent years.
Well, John, as I'm sure you've seen, the ideological offensive in the U.S. and the big press is already on in terms of their takeaways of the election. And there's a lot of talk about, the Plan C and the issue of the reforms and the possibility, the way that I saw it presented in The Economist, basically, that, they'll destroy all regulatory and reform agencies. But I know that this is a big factor because it's addressing some of the things AMLO was stymied by because of the legal process. So if you could talk about sort of this second story, the Plan C, and some of the things that Ms. Scheinbaum has proposed that were very popular, but that obviously have already drawn the ire, I think, of a lot of the big business-linked press around the world.
Yes, this is a bit. So for the last 30 years of the Democratic kind of transition, they call it transition, but it wasn't actually as fast as people saw it being. There's been a very intense division between the different parties. So there have been three major parties, PRI, PAN, and PRD, who have basically divided up government. And now, all of a sudden, there's going to be one hegemonic party, right? And this does remind people of what existed before, right? The PRI, the Party of the Institutional Revolution, dominated the entire political sphere between the 40s and the 80s. And so people are saying that what's happening now is a return to the previous system of a single hegemonic party. But the actual story is very different, because this single hegemonic party is actually the outsider party, right, which had been excluded totally through from this democratic transition, from obviously the previous system as well. And so the victory of López Obrador in 2018 and of Claudia Sheinbaum in 2024 is not really a pro-establishment power grab, but it's part of this resistance to the economic and political powers that be. And the blowout, the total victories last Sunday was surprising even to those of us who sympathize with the left. And it's shocking, these international financial press, because theoretically, right, they're especially worried about the month of September, because the new Congress comes in the 1st of September and Claudia Sheinbaum comes in the 1st of October. And López Obrador from past February presented a whole array of a dozen constitutional reforms, as you mentioned. It's called the Plan C. This is the idea that I can get into the history of that, but it's called Plan C because these reforms were not originally passed by Congress, because Congress was not, Morena didn't have a control over the 2/3 of that of Congress, and so they was rejected by Congress. That was the Plan A, and then Plan B was that the Supreme Court also threw the second version out. And so the Plan C was that the third version is going directly to the voters and have the voters decide, right, not Congress or the court, but kind of a plebiscite is what we had this last Sunday. And so what kind of reforms is López Obrador talking about? He wants to democratize the judiciary. So, for instance, he wants the Supreme Court ministers to be elected by popular vote. This would be a huge change in Mexico, of course, because the Supreme Court and the judiciary is sort of the bastion of conservative thinking, as it is in many countries. And to have an electoral vote for them would turn them into, the international financial press is afraid, into these, populist people who decide based on, general, democratic interests and not on their sort of more abstract interpretations of law in accord with, economic stability, however they understand it. So that's one big reform. There's another electoral reform. He wants to change the way in which the distribution of the seats in the House and the Senate is made. A pro-indigenous reform, giving more rights to local communities in Oaxaca and Chiapas, particularly in the southern part of Mexico. There's a whole the electoral authorities themselves also have this problem that the electoral authorities tend to be sort of isolated from citizen opinion. He wants to that lead counselors and magistrates, electoral magistrates, also to be elected by popular vote. He's already done this some part of the way, but he wants to advance in making social rights in the Constitution, rights for elderly to youth to have scholarships and support from the state. There's a whole long list of social and political reforms that he wants to push through, and with this, if these 2/3 actually, the final decision is going to be the next few days by the electoral authorities. But if that actually happens in September, he'll basically be able to do whatever he wants. And that's kind of scary for these guys. Another big issue, energy reform, for instance, lithium. One of the major reforms that López Obrador tried to get through, he couldn't get through Congress, was to nationalize completely the lithium deposits in Mexico. You remember this was actually one of the reasons why Evo Morales was submitted to fraud, coup d'etat, and his re-election effort in 2019, because of the very important strategic nature of lithium. López Obrador would also like to nationalize lithium. So all these things are, of course, going to be of concern to the international press, but are exciting for us here in Mexico, because the fact is that these first 6 years, the changes were relatively slow because of all this resistance from the opposition. And with this new stage in the next 6 years, that's very important. It's a 6-year period. It's not 4, not 3, not 2, it's 6 years. Big things might happen. But we still have this pressure from the United States. That's the big boot on our neck, of course.
Yeah, no, absolutely, for sure. Well, we'll hope for positive developments here in the United States to enforce more positive developments there in Mexico. But as always, John, we really appreciate you having you on. John Ackerman, professor at the Institute for Legal Research at UNAM. Thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you, Eugene. Rania, please come visit us soon. No, once if Trump comes in November, you're going to have to come running down south to look for democracy here in Mexico City. And Mexico City is a wonderful place. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's a great place to live, and we'd love to see you guys and your audience too. It's please come get to know Mexico City and Mexico. It's a wonderful country.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, John. Yeah, it's actually
Well, there
one of
you
my
have
favorite
it.
cities.
Breakthrough News. Well, the entire Breakthrough News audience was just invited to Mexico City. So pack your bags, you guys.
Let me tell you, I was
We're
there in
going to
2018, and
Mexico.
I literally was there in 2018, and I almost bought an apartment. Like that's how much I loved it. I was like looking into the cost in a friend's building. Like it's an amazing, great place, beautiful arts, beautiful museums, great people, great colors. So yes, we're going to do a Freedom Side live from Mexico City. Mark that down. It's going to happen. We'll make
Become
it
a
work.
patron. It'll happen sooner.
That's true. The
Become
more
a patron,
patronage
it'll
we have,
happen
yeah,
sooner.
the more money you can give, the easier it will be for us to be live from Mexico City. But yeah, no, it'll be great. Excellent. Super important story, super important piece. And I just want to note before we move on to our next topic that you, Rania Kalik, along with our friend Zoe Alexandra from People's Dispatch, you did an interview with Claudia Sheinbaum last year as she was becoming a presidential candidate. Asked her all about various different things, her beliefs, her philosophy, where she's coming from. You can find that on our YouTube page. I think it's highly relevant now, and I hope people after the show have the opportunity to take a look, because I think it's very important to see some of those
And I
pieces
should
there.
add the interview is in English because she does
Yes.
speak English.
She does
so-
speak English.
I
Yeah,
know
she's
people
lived actually here for
get
some
lazy
time.
about subtitles.
Yeah.
So
Sorry, I had to take a drink there. Yeah,
So,
it's
yeah,
amazing. But it
definitely
really is amazing. I think I was looking the other day, I think almost like every country on earth was like quickly sending congratulations within 12 hours. So that always gives you a sense of how big an election is when people from every country, every ideological spectrum are kind of tripping over each other to congratulate you. Well, we want to move on to another critically important story, one we've sort of mentioned obliquely here, and that is the new campaign around Maersk, the shipping company, which is to stop them, from what they are doing, which is, a major shipper of Israeli weapons and I'm sure other things. And we're going to get into that now. And we are honored to be joined here by Nadia Tanous, who's a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement and one of the national leaders of the Mask Off Maersk, great name, campaign. Nadia, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me, y'all. Afternoon. It was really interesting to watch the previous segment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I'm glad you're able to catch some of it. And I guess maybe let's just start here. I mean, Maersk, people maybe see the big containers, but they might not know that much. I mean, tell us something about this company and their complicity in the Israeli genocide and ongoing occupation.
So Maersk is actually the largest logistics company in the world. They are a Danish corporation, and they ship about 14% of their profits are shipping weapons to Israel. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, given that there's a whole pie of profit that they make doing other things, but that's exactly why they're the perfect target. Because Eugene, they actually have shipped demons to the state of Israel since October. They are the biggest dog in the game. And what we want to do as part of this campaign is push them to cut ties with genocide, to cut ties with Israel. We know that they are profiting en masse off the genocide in Gaza. And we know that the United States is unparalleled in the hub that we are for munitions to Israel in order to conduct this genocide. 68% of the weapons that are going to Israel now and have been over the past year are coming straight from the United States. And so that's on top of the fact that Maersk, the largest non-state purchaser, killing on the back end by extracting that gas once the genocide is over in their terms. They're nervous about that contract. They've let Chevron take it before them. And we know that as a Danish company, a Scandinavian company, they want to hide in plain sight. This Maersk campaign is in order to ensure that we don't let them.
So then I want to ask you, how does that pressuring work? Like, where does this a campaign like this even begin? It's such a massive company. These are very deep ties and massive profits we're talking about. So how does a movement begin to pressure a massive company like this to cut its ties with Israel?
That's a great question. One thing that we have for us is that as the Palestinian youth movement and as people in the world who are now setting their eyes on this, logistics are global, and so we know that Maersk operates in Britain. It operates across many of the ports on the west and east coast of the United States, and we know that many of the components, whether it's the components themselves, they're actually manufactured in the global south, and then they're brought to the United States in order to find and create them, and then they are shipped out of our ports. So what we're letting people know, there are literally weapons that are being created that are responsible for genocide at the Israeli state, and they're going across our highways in trucks. They're entering all of our cities using the streets that we operate on every day to go to and from work, and also the ports. So wherever they are, we are. And the other side of this, Rania, is that we want to take a multi-pronged approach. So we're about building the labor sector. We're talking about building across, a population of narratives saying, look, Maersk, we're anti-war and we're anti-U.S. imperialism. Not only is Maersk the biggest dog in the game, they're the largest contributor to Israeli weapons shipments at this time from the United States. They also were responsible for shipping 9% of the weapons to Iraq and Afghanistan from 2001 to 2012. Wow. They have been playing a role for a long time. What about South African apartheid and the era of supporting fascism across the continent? What about the participation in U.S. Wars all over the world? Maersk has played a critical role. And so a lot of this is also outing them in terms of their narrative of, going carbon neutral by 2040 or trying to support more of their workers with fair contracts. Maersk also has a plethora of labor violations, including human trafficking on the high seas. And so we know that where we are, we have a strategic position to actually be able to not just go after one weapons company, Grumman, BAE Systems. We can actually go after all of them by hitting the logistics that transport. And that's our message for this summer, is to take on all hands-on-deck approach through a coordinated multi-pronged strategy that actually gets to the heart of Maersk's complicity. And we believe because this is a huge industry, but it only makes up 14% of their profits, they will actually back away and cut ties with genocide. You might also ask, why Maersk and why not another company? Because we don't believe that we can press or MSC, which makes their sole money on transporting weapons. We can't dissuade them from doing that work. That's how they make their profits. That's what they do. But for Maersk, a small portion of their larger profit. But we have our eyes on them, and we will not let them get away with this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, one thing I want to speak to, and you alluded to it here in terms of the reference to apartheid South Africa and, of course, the struggle against it. And that is, the importance of this phase of the movement. I mean, of course, we know the importance of protest, of civil disobedience, of all these other people, but, boycott and divestment and all these other pieces. Talk, if you could, just about the importance of this in terms of our overall movement strategy.
Absolutely. We've seen, for example, some of the populist models of organizing around ceasefire resolutions, which we know has had no effect on the decisions that the political class is making. But however, We have been able to actually find them in every corner. Wherever they go, they get no peace, and they understand that the people of this, inside of this empire, are not putting up, they're not buying the narrative that they forward for so long around the necessity of supporting Israel's onslaught in the region and the hegemony that Israel in the region. Talk about moving beyond ceasefire, we also have to talk about what divestment 3.0 looks like. So, Eugene, we're looking at divestment kind of the way that the city word divest from Chevron, not just a narrative campaign, no one, where cities and campuses that have investments in Maersk can actually divest so we can also hit them at the municipal level. This is part of a larger coordination and effort to move from mowing in the streets every day, being able to have these mass marches, which we must continue to do. They're critical for our movement and they're critical for our message and to keep the pressure up. But have to think, what is another tool? What mobilization? And we know there has to be organization. We have a lot of power in our locales. We have a lot of power when we work together, multi-sect approaches. Maersk is also Mask Off Maersk is also an intersectional campaign where we're talking about the role of imperialism and war, the role of the extractive industry and profiteering on weapons that often happen behind closed doors, but is managed through our streets, through our labor, through our cities, through our campuses, and this is what we're asking for. We know that 8 months into genocide, it feels like, what more can we do? Well, there's a lot more we can do. We hit the big actors that are making this genocide turn, work, continue, and make sure that they don't get off the hook, whether that's a government entity or whether that's a corporate one.
So I guess then the question becomes, for those who are on board and are like, yes, let's pressure this company to end its complicity in genocide. What can people do? Where can they go to find out more information about getting involved in a campaign like this?
Go to Palestinian Youth Movement on any of our socials. If you are an organization or a coalition that's interested in one of our fronts, one of these strategies, please contact us through the website. We have been, in correspondence with so many people who have a direct connection with Maersk, whether that be the first responders who responded to the Maersk ship that crashed the Baltimore Bridge, whether that be those folks who have tracking labor violations out the port of London, whether that be the labor violations and the folks who are fighting fair contract in the port of LA. We are asking anyone who has interest in joining this campaign to support it, to look at where Maersk is up around you, and if you're an organ coalition, some interest, please do connect with us. And furthermore, we are going to continue some of it and sharing about specifics. We know how difficult it is to get good information on the flow of weapons around the world, but we also know that there are many actors who are tracking it. Detroit was the ship that was hit by Somali pirates in 2013. We all remember that meme. I'm the captain now. That was a Maersk ship. There are 2 Maersk ships that were stopped any resistance in the Red Sea carrying weapons. We know that Maersk operates across the eastern seaboard, that community that also works at the port outside of Elizabeth, for example, or in New Jersey, the different ports there. They're huge in terms of shipping out weapons to Israel. So we know where they are. Our to Maersk is that they will not continue to this behind closed doors. And while they're shipping, we will not allow them also pick up the mantle of profiting on genocide on the back end through extracting the marine fuel under Gaza. If they want to touch it, we stare down. So that's the message, is to join the coalition and to get involved, because this campaign is going to be major throughout the summer and for however long it takes to make them cut ties with genocide.
Well, mask off Maersk. You have your marching orders. We were very, very honored to be joined by you here, Nadia. Thank you so much. Nadia Tanous, who is a national leader with the Mask Off Maersk campaign and also a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Rania?
Well, Eugene, I think that's a fantastic campaign. People should go get involved. And man, it's shocking how many companies are just complicit in genocide. It's not, it's the material advantage of colonialism is still shining bright. So we got to, I don't know. I was going to make an analogy about putting out the candle. I don't know. I'm getting poetic suddenly. I don't know.
That's maybe not your field, but that's okay.
No, I'm not a poet. Sorry, guys.
No, listen.
But no, I really do mean, it's like, it is shocking just how many international conglomerates are making a profit off of the destruction of Palestine. And that's why it continues. That's why all of these imperialist countries support it. It's, that's what colonialism does. It profits these massive companies. So you got to get them where it hurts. Their bottom line.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that, obviously we've already seen the restricting of shipping has a big aspect on them. That was deep. I didn't know that they want to get the marine fuel out of the offshore, gas deposits in Gaza. And this is, Denmark, which is allegedly everyone is so, green over there, I guess. And that's not a shot at the people of Denmark. I'm sure many of you who are watching from Denmark do care about climate change. But that being said, these big corporations are just total liars. But yeah, I mean, it makes you just think totally differently when you see those containers driving down the highway or on the railroads or stacked up at the ports or whatever it may be. So yeah, maskoffmaersk.com, interesting campaign. I think people should get themselves educated about that. Well, Rania, I think that pretty much wraps it up for us here today. There's, of course, much news. We could go 24 hours if we wanted to, but got to save a little something for the viewers with the other content we're constantly putting out, like Dispatches with Rania Khalek. And you mentioned it earlier, Rania, but what should people do if they want to support our continued content creation?
Well, especially if you want us to get to that point where we're 24 hours, you definitely need to become a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news. Become a member of Breakthrough News for as little as $5 a month, though we're very happy if you want to give more. If you are able, you can help support this independent media project so we can continue to grow and bring you the kind of news that is based on reality and not on the fantasies or psychopathy of the crazy ruling class that wants to keep us in perpetual war so they can keep profiting off of starving much of the world and, sometimes genocide.
Yes, indeed. Appreciate that.
Wow.
Patreon.com/breakthrough news. You can also get a mug. But most importantly, you'll get a lot more content from Rania Khalek. And who doesn't want that? And if you don't want that, you better not say anything in the chat because we will ban you forever. Nonetheless, thanks to everyone, of course, who's watching. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget, hit subscribe and hit the bell. If you're watching on Free Speech TV, I'm just going to salute you, shout you out, and say continue to follow FSTV. And I want to shout out the whole crew there for making it possible for the Freedom Side to appear on Free Speech TV. For myself, for Rania Khalek, and for our whole Breakthrough News team, we will see you next time.